Welcome to the Persuasive Mindset, your podcast guide to mastering the art of persuasion by exploring its role across diverse fields through in-depth conversations with experts. I am your host, Dr. Serena Mate-de-Londra. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Dorothée Baumann-Pauly, Director of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights and Research Director at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. In this episode, Dr. Baumann-Pauly discusses the transformative power of aligning business practices with human rights, sharing insights on how rigorous research and storytelling can address challenges like child labor in global supply chains. She reflects on her pioneering case studies from cobalt sourcing to sustainable apparel and their impact on ethical business models. We explore why integrating human rights into core operations is essential for creating a just economy. And when it comes to persuasion, she argues that facts need to be coupled with storytelling to help contextualize and make the facts more relatable. As well, she offers practical advice for students and early career professionals on infusing ethical leadership into any career path. Whether you're passionate about business ethics, human rights, or career growth, this episode is for you. Now, let's dive into our conversation with Dr. Baumann-Pauly. Enjoy! Thank you for taking time to speak with us today. As we start our conversation, I'd like to highlight that currently you are the director of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights and also the research director at NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. Could you please briefly explain, first, what does your current work entail? And second, what are some of the most pressing issues you're addressing in your work?
Thanks, Serena, for having me. Indeed, I'm involved in two institutions. I'm, since 2013, the research director at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. And since 2019, I'm leading the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. These are sister organizations with aligned missions. We want to advance human rights in corporate practice, and our work starts with rigorous research. That's the foundation from which we then derive an advocacy agenda. Key themes right now include just transition. How can we source critical minerals from all parts of the world to accelerate the just transition? How can we make sure that migrant workers are well protected? There are still evergreen themes, sadly, such as child labor and forced labor. We've started addressing decades ago, but we just haven't moved the dial on these issues yet. And so we need a better understanding of the root causes driving those issues in global supply chains. And overall, I think right now we live in challenging times for human rights. We also need to figure out stronger ways of persuading that human rights makes good business sense.
How do you ensure that you can translate your research into practical impact?
I conduct research and then I use the research findings as the basis for advocacy. I want to make sure that what we learned is being put into practice.
How do you believe that your background in business ethics helped to shape your approach to both business and also human rights?
Broadly, indeed, I was trained in the tradition of business ethics. I have a PhD from the University of Zurich in economics with a focus on business ethics. I would say that's the big umbrella, but for the past 15 years, I've really done work in this emerging field of business and human rights. I think either has a core objective, namely to train the next generation in critical thinking. Ethic means to critically reflect on the morals of our time. So to take a step back and reflect, are we on the right path? Is this the world and the economy we want to live in? Maybe just another word on business and human rights, because there are many terms flirting around: sustainability, corporate citizenship, corporate social responsibility. What matters most to me in the end, I spent quite a bit of time defining various terms in this field, but this is a very academic exercise. And I've also noticed in practice, this is not what truly matters. What is important to me, the one distinction that matters to me, is that my work focuses on how companies make their money. I'm not interested in how they spend it. This is the philanthropic part of corporate social responsibility. That means that companies continue with business as usual. And if that business generates enough profits, they have money left over to spend for nice things. I'm most concerned about how do they make their money in other ways to align business models with a commitment to respect human rights in core business operations.
Why do you believe it is important for academics to connect research with practical outcomes?
That's a good question, because most academics only do the theory and do not fully tease out practical implications. That's often just a small paragraph at the end of their academic articles that focus on theory, development, or testing theory. I believe those two things belong together. After all, we're academics at public institutions paid by taxpayers' money. And I think we have interesting things to say about the society and economy we live in. So I feel there's an obligation to use the rigorous analysis that we conduct with our research to also then translate it to recommendations for companies, policymakers, that can truly benefit from our insights. So that connection, I think, is really important. And again, we live in times where science doesn't get a good rep anymore, but I believe it's absolutely foundational for making informed decisions.
I'd like to go a little bit further into the topic of impact. Could you please point us to some specific impact that you believe your work has had on corporate behavior?
That's a really difficult question, because it assumes that I can sort of really draw a direct causal relationship between my research and my work to a changed behavior in a corporation. And I cannot do that because, of course, I'm part of an ecosystem that I would say enhances the issue maturity of certain things and hopefully eventually gets to a tipping point where companies can no longer deny certain facts and have to act. And there are always many actors that drive such themes. Over the past 5 years, I've focused on one research project focused on sourcing cobalt responsibly from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Cobalt is a critical battery mineral that we need to power electric vehicles. And the conditions of cobalt sourcing in the Congo are dire. Child labor is very common and mining accidents happen all the time, including fatalities that are never reported. And so we have this tension between the need to accelerate the energy transition and, on the other hand, massive human rights abuses in the mineral supply chains all over the world. In my case, I focused on Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the premise is we need electric vehicles, and then consequently companies need help to figure out how to source critical battery minerals responsibly. And in all my work, I want to be solutions oriented. I'm trying to identify what could work. And so in the context of cobalt, I identified a solution for artisanal small scale miners that are not a side note to the cobalt supply chain. They actually provide up to 30% of the cobalt from the Congo comes from these much smaller, informal mines. And this is where the human rights risks are the greatest. And with the help of my work, responsible sourcing standards were drafted, and those responsible sourcing standards are now the foundation for a government agency called Entreprise Générale du Cobalt. That agency had a bit of up and down over the past years, but right now it looks like they want to take these responsible sourcing standards to scale at many other artisanal mines in the country. And in the context of my work, I pushed hard for large mining companies to integrate those informal miners. And there has just recently been a policy change that makes a legal gray zone clearer for those large industrial mines to allow the integration for artisanal miners in collaboration with the state agency Cobalt. So there has been developments that make the solutions that I identified in this specific context more likely for application.
In today's world, why is it important to focus on cobalt sourcing in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and what should we know about this?
About 2/3 of the world's cobalt come from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the country in the heart of Africa, with over 100 million people. Very poor country, a country challenged by epidemics, by conflict, war, and yet it's such a critical country for the energy transition. And natural resources cannot be moved easily. So there's no other place in the world that could provide and meet our cobalt demands. This is different in other industries. I've worked for years on the global apparel supply chain. And as soon as there are issues in one country, companies are immediately checking where else could we produce ready-made garments. For cobalt, again, these are natural resources that lie in the ground, and over half of the world's cobalt resources are estimated to be in the Congo. So any company that needs critical battery minerals will eventually have to deal with the Congo. And that had a certain appeal to me, that companies cannot easily switch, but actually need to figure out this really complicated business context in the Congo.
How do your case studies illustrate practical solutions for integrating human rights into business operations?
The case studies are, for me, a way to illustrate what could work in the context of business human rights, what approaches could companies apply to integrate human rights in core business operations. And I think it's most convincing if you have real companies and real issues to deal with. It's important to me that these companies develop models that could be replicable and scalable. So I'm not too interested in a small pilot project that only work in the context of, a Western democracy. But I want to go to the hard places where companies innovated business models and solutions that others can adopt as well. And indeed, we have a series of case studies in different industry contexts, from finance and sustainability linked loans to the cobalt work that I just mentioned, focused on operational solutions for artisanal small-scale miners, understanding the huge impact that this solution could have for thousands of miners in the Congo. We've looked into diamond mining in Botswana, again, reflecting on the diamond supply chain, which has been operating in a certain way for decades, if not centuries. And now I think there's a moment where we should step back and reflect, isn't there another way of doing this to make sure that the countries of origin, such as Botswana, truly benefit from their natural resource, and we can overcome that pattern of extractivism that we've seen, particularly in African countries, for so long. I've done work on the apparel industry. So one case study deals with Decathlon and their purchasing practices, which they've applied to their global supply chain. Unusual in that they make long-term sourcing commitments. It's rare in the apparel industry, through strategic partners that they engage with for 5, ideally 10 or even 20 years. And of course, this long-term engagement gives the company a chance to truly work with those factories, enhance their productivity, the quality, and also labor rights standards for workers in those factories. So this is just sort of an overview of the various sectors that we've covered through our case studies. I do write them to capture, again, what works, and I use them in my teaching. They provide real examples and storytelling for the students, but they're also used by other actors, including civil society organizations. I just presented them to a group of civil society organizations that are part of OECD Watch. And they said, this is really useful work for us, because as they're challenging companies, they often need to point to practices that have been put in place. So, for example, if a company says we cannot have full supply chain transparency, well, they can point to cases where they say, well, but hang on, is that really true? Because we have examples of companies where they have actually achieved full supply chain transparency. So debunking some of the myths and excuses that companies have used by providing a reference point at a higher, just raising the bar.
How do you believe that your case studies help influence or inspire other companies?
I think it's also inspirational for other companies. So when I present these cases to other companies, they're really happy to hear about these solutions. I think most people that I meet who work for companies are very keen to be part of solutions, and the question of how do solutions look like. So I think we're at a point where there's a principled agreement that companies shouldn't harm people. And the question is how to put this into practice. So more guidance on the how, on the actual implementation. I think this is what also companies are craving for.
For listeners to better understand your work, could you please describe some specific case studies you've already worked on and the companies involved in those case studies?
We've done work on strategic long-term partnerships with Decathlon. The sustainability-linked loans in the finance context was an example by ABN AMRO, which is now being scaled by other banks. We have worked with a small company in the diamond mining context called HB Antwerp and HB Botswana. In the context of cobalt sourcing from the Congo, this was a pilot initiated by a Swiss commodity trading company, Trafigura, which again is now being looked at through the state agency and other commodity trading companies that would like to replicate it. One case study that I haven't mentioned yet referred to sustainable rubber sourcing from the Amazon in Brazil through a company called VEJA, a French sneaker company that produces the soles of their shoes with 40% rubber from the Amazon, sourced in a way that empowers local communities who live in the Amazon forest and also has built-in financial incentives to slow down deforestation.
What does it actually mean to align profits and principles within the context of our case studies?
As you can imagine, writing these cases takes time because we have to build trust with the companies to do the investigation. I'm not going to talk about any cases that I dropped where I decided this is not a model that is scalable or that's just not at the level that I want for sort of a threshold that companies should meet. But the ones that we featured, I'm not endorsing the company as a whole, but I think they have engaged in business practices that are interesting enough and that are pointing in the right direction for what we call aligning profits and principles. How can we support successful businesses to conduct business in the way that is respectful for human rights? That's what I mean by aligning profits and principles.
Could you go a little bit into further detail to describe the process for developing these case studies and also how do you ensure that they are reliable?
Writing these case studies is not a quick process. As I said before, it takes quite some time to first identify a potential candidate, then learning enough about the company and their business practices to have some confidence that it's worth going deeper, reaching out to the company to have sort of a first set of conversations, getting the approval to do more. I absolutely believe that you have to go and see with your own eyes. So just interviews with headquarters won't cut it. You want to see how business practices play out in the places where the company is operating. And in my context, this is often in global supply chains. It's really important to do these field visits to understand the impacts on people and communities. That's what we've done in the Amazon forest. That's what we've done in Botswana. I've also been to Ethiopia to look at factories that produce apparel. In the context of finance, I didn't take a field trip. As always in finance, it's a remote relationship of the financial institution. And the sustainability-linked loans that we highlighted as a way for financial institutions to integrate human rights in their lending practices was verified through a multi-stakeholder initiative in this specific case. The multi-stakeholder initiative was the RSPO, the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. And the bank, ABN AMRO, required palm oil producers to join this MSI and their system. And as the palm oil producers could show progress towards improving labor rights conditions or working conditions on palm oil plantations, the bank actually gave them access to more preferential interest rates. So again, there was a financial incentive built in for palm oil companies to make progress towards improving working conditions. But the implementation part was managed through the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil and their system. I thought this was a smart way of connecting a third-party independent verification body to access to preferential interest rates that ABNM then offered in an interest to invest in palm oil companies that just have more robust businesses, including decent working conditions for workers on palm oil plantations.
Broadly speaking, how long does it take to produce these case studies, and how do you assess the scalability of the models that you discover with the help of your case studies?
The process usually takes at least 18 months because typically there are a series of interviews. So initially you talk to some people, you go into the field, and you come back to people you talked initially. And then often beyond the case of that individual company that we're featuring, we want to understand if other companies would be interested in taking up the model that we've identified. So for example, in the context of rubber sourcing from the Amazon, we wrote the case about VEJA, but we then learned in the process that there's another company that is currently being coached by VEJA to understand the model and apply it at a much, much bigger scale. And that company is Michelin. It's a French tire company that, of course, has massive demands for rubber. And a portion of the rubber they're planning to source in the future will come from the Amazon, applying the same model that VEJA had innovated. So to me, this shows that it's a scalable model and replicable by a much, much bigger company. So then the case moves to sort of a larger company.
I'd love to better understand the process of writing these case studies. I'm curious to know, do you collaborate with others to produce them, and what are your future plans for this impactful work?
The case studies are a massive amount of work, but it's mostly been done by myself, at least initially. And now I'm very happy to report that I have a slightly bigger team beyond the University of Geneva, namely colleagues from the University of New South Wales. Over the past couple of years, I've worked with Justine Nolan, the director of the Australian Human Rights Centre, and her colleague, Andy Symington. And traveling together, for example, to the Amazon, and then last year with Justine to Botswana, it makes it much easier to bounce impressions off each other and make sure that we interpret the context the right way. We can split up and do interviews separately and then come together again, also in the write-up, check each other's work and refine it. And that's been really, really helpful. I enjoy that collaboration, and we're actually moving forward and currently work on a book on transformational business models where we will cluster the cases that we've done so far, about 10. And then in the second part of the book, use the cases to derive drivers and enablers for human rights in business. So what actually helps to implement human rights in business? What does good human rights due diligence in practice look like? These are questions for the second part of the book, which we will derive from those case studies. I'm excited about teasing out what makes business models truly transformational across those cases, sort of the lessons learned from the past 6 years of work.
What is your approach to conducting research-related interviews, and particularly when you look at the case studies that you produce?
So interviewing for research, you can do it like a journalist and just drill people's brain and distill their knowledge. This is not how I conduct my interviews. I actually want to build a relationship with the person I'm interviewing, because this is the exact contact that I need later on to then help me advocate for my findings. So typically I don't interview people just once, but multiple times. And I really want to understand where they're coming from, where they see actual solutions. And so I'm not narrowly just drilling them to solicit their knowledge, but I want to enlist them as allies for my work. And this is a way of socializing the type of research you do. And it helps me later, once the research report is out, to then work with these people to advance the practical recommendations.
How do you go about publishing your work, and who are your main target audiences?
I publish my work in various formats for various audiences because I have a very broad and heterogeneous audience for my work. One I'm not very good with is the academic audience. So we're not publishing frequently in academic journals. Instead, our main mission is to advance human rights in corporate practice. So we want to publish in places and in ways that allow corporate actors to engage. And this is a model that I think was invented by NYU Stern Center, that we write public reports in a language that's easily accessible to broader audiences, and we make sure that other media outlets actually report about our reports, and we're shaping a public discourse with our work. So that's most important to us, the public discourse that companies need to acknowledge, because I can tell you corporate practitioners do not read the academic journals. And as an academic at a business school, I think it's important to reach our key audience, namely the corporate representatives. And if they don't read academic journals, I think that's a problem. That means that business school academia is very separated from its target audience. And I think it's important to build a bridge between academia and practice. And so we've chosen other formats and other outlets to reach corporate practitioners. There's also work that focuses or that also targets policymakers. After all, they have to set the frame for business to flourish, and have advice for what does good policy look like. For example, in the context of tech and human rights, we focused a lot on regulation because we do not think companies can self-regulate in this space.
I'm curious to know, how does being based in Switzerland influence your work?
I've been based in Switzerland for over a decade. I'm now a proud citizen of Switzerland. And for my work, I think it's a fantastic base because Switzerland has a really unique ecosystem with historically grown roots and a very rich human rights landscape in Geneva in particular, but also an unparalleled density of multinational corporations. And of course, the Swiss economy that consists of over 90% of small and medium-sized companies. So it's really an ecosystem that brings together human rights and business in quite a unique way. I think we're ideally positioned in Geneva, and we're very happy to be proud of the University of Geneva, because to me, bringing these themes into business schools and business school education is a priority. We believe that the next generation of managers needs to be trained in the classroom for how to navigate these really difficult business challenges. Switzerland has sectors that I think are particularly interesting from a business human rights perspective. You mentioned finance before, and Geneva is an important hub for commodity traders. I believe commodity traders are the overlooked actor in global supply chain research, and they have a lot of knowledge and leverage, and we should include them in our work. They are trading key commodities like gold, coffee, cocoa. I think every third cup of coffee we drink in Switzerland somehow goes through Switzerland through the trading. And I think these are all areas where I want to do more work on. There's the luxury sector in Switzerland. Traders are also dealing with transition minerals. So I find it very easy to connect my work with priority sectors and key sectors in Switzerland.
How do you balance both your roles between the University of Geneva and New York University, given that they are located on different continents?
Initially, I started as the research director in New York, and we then relocated back to Switzerland. And in the first years, I was there full time and I traveled more frequently to New York. With the pandemic, a lot moved online and I do most of my work from here, but I see my colleagues in various places every 6 to 8 weeks. So the director of the NYU Stern Center comes through Europe frequently. So I meet him here and I go to New York 3-4 times a year, sometimes a bit longer over the summer. In the past years, my family and I usually spend summers in New York, which was a good time to catch up with the team. And so we made it work. Our research also doesn't play out in Europe or the US. So for the research and for the field research, we travel to places like Ethiopia, or Botswana, or the Amazon. And so travel is needed anyway. Initially in New York, we had a big research project on the apparel industry in Bangladesh. And it was actually easier to get to Bangladesh from Geneva than from New York.
In hindsight, what do you believe shaped your career path in business and human rights?
I think what was really influential was my time in the US. The tone and spirit at academic institutions in the US is very different from European institutions. I really appreciate this excited can-do attitude in the US that I've experienced in the academic institutions there. It was inspiring for me to work with really smart people in the US. And I'm very happy that I still have this connection to an academic institution in the US. Generally, I would say early on, I was drawn to a profession that would allow me to align my values with something that I do every day. There was not a straight line towards that, but everything I did, I tried to do very well. So I started studying political science and I just loved it, international relations. And then I realized, well, we're only talking about governments, but the real action is often with private actors, companies, NGOs. And these were actors that in my political science studies came up very rarely. And I felt that's wrong. So I transitioned towards, in the end, I did a PhD in economics, and that transition was a logical one for me. So one thing often led to the other, and everything I did, I tried to do well at a given point in time, and it often opened doors for the next thing. And I think that would be also my career advice, really dive into what you do right now, and it will lead to the next thing.
Do you believe your upbringing influenced your career choice to work in business and human rights?
I'm not sure, but I don't think my parents are surprised. So to them, I think I've found a context that fits my personality and fits what I always wanted to do. My parents are not involved in academia. They're both civil servants. They're now retired. But I think what was important for me growing up was growing up in a household that was very political. We had fierce discussions every night over dinner that was encouraged, and also something I greatly enjoyed. And I learned a lot from this context.
I believe you grew up in Germany and left the country by the age of 20. How did your international experience help shape your career?
I actually started the university in Germany and then I went on an exchange to the UK. And I've been back briefly to finish my German degree, never fully relocated back to Germany. There were other places where I had to be, in the US and in Switzerland mostly. I did other exchanges too with Australia and the UK and Spain, but my formative years, I would say, were in Switzerland and in the US.
I'd like to shift gears and ask, what are your views on teaching as a craft, and what is your approach to teaching business and human rights?
I love teaching. That's, I think, key to the philosophy. I think you really need to love the subject you're teaching. And I think you should love your students. If you do not like your students, it's so much harder to connect with them. So I come into the classroom with an interest in who's in front of me and how to connect with them. And I think that makes a good teacher. You want to connect with your audience. You need to understand a bit where they come from, what their current knowledge base is, and then hopefully excite them with the work that excites me.
How do you approach public speaking in order to engage diverse audiences?
I can't say I was trained in a method of public speaking, but it's much easier to speak publicly about a subject that you love. And the same that what I said about teaching applies to public speaking. I think speakers should make an effort to figure out who's in the audience, how can we connect to the audience, and how can I build a bridge between where they are and where you're coming from. The transferable skills, first of all, you need to be analytically rigorous to have something to say of substance. But then you also need to find ways to translate your deep dives in ways that excite an audience. So that often requires finding common language, simplifying, and finding hooks that the audience can relate to. Understanding their concerns and where they're coming from often is a way into then transitioning into the work that you want to put forward.
How does persuasion factor into your work, such as in teaching or in helping to improve business standards?
Look, for long I was hoping that facts could persuade, but I think we now live in different times and we see the pushback against undeniable facts, like in the context of climate change, and also huge success of politically motivated disinformation. That clearly shows that many people cannot be convinced with facts alone, or don't distrust facts, actually. And so I think the facts need to be coupled with some storytelling to contextualize, to make the facts more relatable. And I also believe in the need to identify unusual allies. So if you find allies for your work that are close to your target audience, they can tell the story much better than you can. So ideally, you're finding multipliers that can talk to your target audience. In the context of my work, for example, it would be most powerful if companies would speak up for the need to integrate human rights in business school education. I think that would make deans to listen up. If companies would be loud and clear about the need to hire future employees that have been trained on how to navigate human rights challenges. So I would love for companies to speak louder on that topic.
What types of skills do you value the most in your work?
I've always appreciated people who really see the bigger picture. That requires analytical strength, particularly in the middle of complicated and messy processes. Certainly a skill I appreciated much, but the analytical rigor alone is not enough. It also requires a clear moral compass and some moral courage to speak up for what matters and where we need to go. I see a lot of smart people not speaking up when it matters because it's more work, it's uncomfortable. And particularly now, I think this is something that needs to change. Smart people need to find ways to also influence what's going on in our societies.
What upcoming research are you excited about?
I'm really excited about upcoming research that I'm conducting with my colleague, Dr. Berit Knaak and Farmstrong Foundation in the Ivory Coast on the cocoa supply chain. We are trying to assess whether new technologies, Earth observation technologies, can help us to prioritize human rights risks in global supply chains, because according to the UN guiding principles for business human rights, companies should really start their work where the most salient risks lie, where the risks are the greatest. And in the cocoa supply chain, we know that the risk of child labor has been existing for decades. And to really move the dial on child labor, we should test whether we can employ new technologies to identify the highest risk areas. And so we will be in the Ivory Coast looking for places that we identified with Earth observation technology, particularly forest disturbances, where small farmers grow cocoa for export. And with Earth observation technology, you can then also measure the distance to the next road, to the next school. Forest disturbances indicate farming is going on. If cocoa is grown there, cocoa is exclusively for export. If the next school and the next road is so far away, clearly the kids who will live on this farm will not have a chance to go to school, and that constitutes a high risk for child labor. And using these technologies to identify the high risk areas, again, this is something that we want to encourage companies to do. And we're currently testing the hypothesis that with Earth observation technology, you can really identify high-risk areas for child labor, because currently many projects targeting child labor cluster around the capital of the Ivory Coast, Abidjan, and they do not go into the more remote areas where we believe the risks for child labor are even greater.
What is your advice to students who are interested in pursuing a career in business and human rights?
I would actually not advise to seek a career in the specific business and human rights field. I know your listeners are students and young professionals. And of course, I get this question a lot. How can I get a foot in the door in this field? And there's just not many positions as of yet. But I think what you learn in my classes should be sort of the guiding force of everything you do in the future. I think you can become an accountant or a marketing professional and still have business and human rights as your moral compass. And as you rise in the corporate hierarchies or organizational hierarchies and you assume leadership positions, I think the themes from my class, which are essentially leadership themes, will become more and more important. My boss at NYU Stern, Michael Posner, he says, typically in your 7th job of your career, these themes will come back to you. And so not necessarily in your first job out of college. Junior positions often are very technical and you have to demonstrate that you have these strong technical skills. But even then, infusing what you do with understanding potential implications on human rights, this is what you can do throughout. You can do it as a marketing professional, as an accountant, as someone who manages procurement and global supply chains. These themes are everywhere if you look through a lens of human rights, and you can work on these themes even if your title doesn't include human rights.
And as we conclude our conversation, I'd like to ask, what advice would you like to give to students who would like to work at the intersection of business, ethics, and human rights?
That's a difficult question. I think a key advice for my business school students would be to make sure that you enter business contexts where you don't have to leave your values at the door, that you can actually advance your values through what you do, because that would then also automatically create the type of economy that I think we need. And please, as a business graduate, also consider public office, because we need really smart, business-trained policymakers as well.
And that concludes our conversation for today. If you enjoyed this discussion, please be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with others who might benefit from it. Until next time, be well!